Now we will take a look on the definitions and discussions on the terms sustainable development and sustainability. The most important definition of sustainable development is presented by the Brundtland Report, Our Common Future, published in 1987. Let's read. The Brundtland Report defines sustainable development on the following terms. Humanity has the ability to make development sustainable to ensure that it meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. The concept of sustainable development does imply limits, not absolute limits, but limitations imposed by the present state of technology and social organization on environmental resources, and also by the ability of the biosphere to absorb the effects of human activities. But technology and social organization can be both managed and improved to make way for a new era of economic growth. The Commission believes that widespread poverty is no longer inevitable. Poverty is not only an evil in itself, but sustainable development requires meeting the basic needs of all and extending to all the opportunity to fulfill their aspirations for a better life. Meeting essential needs requires not only a new era of economic growth for nations in which the majority are poor, but an assurance that those poor get their fair share of resources required to sustain that growth. Sustainable global development requires that those who are the more affluent adopt lifestyles within the planet's ecological means in their use of energy, for example. Further, rapidly growing populations can increase the pressure on resources and slow any rise in living standards. Thus, sustainable development can only be pursued if population size and growth are in harmony with the changing productive potential of the ecosystem. Yet in the end, sustainable development is not a fixed state of harmony, but rather a process of change in which the exploitation of resources, the direction of investments, the orientation of technological development and institutional change are made consistent with future as well as present needs. We do not pretend that the process is easy or straightforward. Painful choices will be made. Thus, in the final analysis, sustainable development must rest on political will. End quote. So, let's get a bit closer. Historically, this concept of sustainable development is a newcomer. Although it was in use already in 1980, was only brought to the center of attention with the Brundtland Report in 1987, and from then on, this term was transformed into a policy proposal and in an epicenter of the global environmental governance. And this was very much evident in the 92 Rio Conference. And particularly the Rio Declaration brought the concept of sustainable development to the forefront as the embodiment of a compromise between two still competing considerations. Development, whether economic or social, but understood as implying economic growth, and environmental protection. Sustainable development offered two advantages. First, it was not associated with a specific group or strand, academic strand or political strand, like, for instance, the expressions eco-development or green economy. And the second advantage is that the vagueness of the concept made it malleable enough to be adopted by all countries after the end of the Cold War without any specific major commitment. In our previous class, we commented about the conservation movement that got attention to the fact that population and economic growth were checked by the absolute limits on resources such as food, energy, water. The overuse of resources was imposing limits to population and to consumption. And also conservationists and environmentalists in the decade of the 60s focused attention on the damage humans were inflicting in the natural world. The term sustainable development, it was a much comprehensive notion of development. But still, however, the limits to growth did not go away. Instead, debates began about whether the concept of sustainable development, as presented by the Brundtland Report, represents a radical agenda for social change or a reformist option. A first useful way to investigate this debate is to distinguish between strong and weak forms of sustainable development. In weak forms of sustainable development, the reduction of a natural capital asset is allowed, provided that another capital asset is increased to compensate the reduction in the first one. So, the weak form allows for a high degree of substitutability between all forms of capital resources. And while this imposes some degree of restriction on natural resource use, these restrictions are not based on concern for the ecosystems themselves. In contrast, those advocating strong forms of sustainable development argue that just protecting the overall amount of natural capital is insufficient because some critical natural capital cannot be replaced by others. There is no such a thing as this substitutability. Sorry, it's a difficult word to pronounce. And according to this view, when human development reaches a global carrying capacity, no forms of natural capital are substitutable. Thus, they claim that there are absolute limits to human development. Others also reject the view that speaks of nature in terms of natural capital, as this term commodifies the natural world, subsuming nature under anthropocentric driven values. Thus, strong forms of sustainable development are identified in philosophical discussions within deep ecology. The deep ecologists argue that, in the long run, environmental reforms of social and economic systems are not a viable solution to stop the accelerating destruction of the environment. The moral and ethical values that legitimize the domination of nature need to be changed, along with the recognition of the place of humans as a species within, as opposed to apart from or dominant over nature and dominant over the other millions of species. Summing up, regarding weak and strong sustainability, the publication of the Brundtland Report opened two fields. In one, those who interpreted that the Brundtland approach promotes weak forms of sustainable development. And in the other field, those who saw the Brundtland Report as an opportunity to promote strong forms. Especially those who think that the report promotes strong forms, they emphasized two key concepts contained in the Brundtland understanding of sustainable development. The concept of needs, in particular the essential needs of the world's poor, to which overriding priority should be given, and the idea of limitations imposed by the state of technology and social organization of the environment's ability to meet present and future needs. All this discussion about the need of economic growth to sustainable development takes us to the notion of degrowth. The idea of degrowth is emerging as a response to this triple crisis, environmental, social, and economic, and the idea is slowing down economic growth based on the narrow economic measure of GDP. So, economic growth refers to increases in real incomes and in the GDP. The idea is that the economy will grow and incomes along with it, leading to a better quality of life. But many trends and social movements point out that this is not a good measure of development. As the feminist movement pointed out, the GDP does not value what is not in the market, such as unpaid domestic work or voluntary work. So, sustainable degrowth is defined as an equitable downscaling of production and consumption that increases the human well-being and enhances ecological conditions at the local and global level. The proponents of sustainable degrowth, they recognize that certain social and small-scale economic activities and impoverished groups or regions may still need to grow. However, growth that externalizes its costs elsewhere are not sustainable. However, as in many other concepts, there are multiple streams of thought here, different interpretations of what degrowth means, and varying views as to how this can be achieved. Nevertheless, they all share in common a focus on the reduction of energy and material throughput to keep within existing biophysical constraints. And they challenge the omnipresence of market-based relations in society, that is, the commodification of all environmental processes. Degrowth also calls for the redistribution of resources between public and private, as well as between generations. It also requires a redistributive downscaling of production and consumption in industrialized countries to achieve environmental sustainability, social justice, and well-being elsewhere. The degrowth literature directly speaks to the limits of growth arguments advanced by strong sustainable development and a radical reading of the Brundtland Report. This can be seen in particular in relation to calls to stay within ecological limits, ecological boundaries, to ensure that development is underpinned by normative principles, and in the commitment to enable pathways for development in the Global South to be realized through reduction in high consumption societies. We will examine the term green growth. It's an approach that ranges from a narrow emphasis on eco-industry and environmental friendly production to a redefinition of a country's entire economy. Between these two extremes, you may find policies that promote low-carbon economies with dematerialization, decoupling of resource use and environmental impacts from economic growth, valuing ecosystem services, or simply increasing energy efficiency. The United Nations Environment Program has been a great proponent of the green economy. A green economy can be thought of as one which is low carbon, resource efficient, and socially inclusive. In a green economy, growth in income and employment should be driven by public and private investments that reduce carbon emissions and pollution, enhance energy and resource efficiency, and prevent the loss of biodiversity and ecosystem services. The degrowth movement calls for an immediate stabilization or reduction of the GDP and incomes. This point of view often appears in the literature, especially on climate debates. So, from the start, green growth has two kinds of opponents. Those rejecting the green part because it makes us deal with ecological issues and there's no limit to concern. And those who cannot accept the growth part because that is what inevitably and irreversibly will doom the planet. The concept of green growth accepts that economic growth in some form will continue to occur. Not only is it inevitable, it is necessary and desirable. But the composition and the trajectory of growth must change through the adoption of new investments, policies, technologies, and behavior. Simply continuing the growth model as it has been practiced in the past is not green growth.